Hi everyone, and welcome to the 11th in our series of commentaries on the crisis, in which we're intending to bring insight into the way businesses are changing, the stages of that change as we work through this crisis, so that we as participants, team members, colleagues can recognise those stages and react better as HR and finance professionals. Looking for the signs of change, etc., and then actually reacting and working with those in more positive ways. So today we'll be focusing more on the new stage of the crisis, which is occurring, which is actually increasingly going back to work and restarting, and then thinking about what the future is. So I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Kevin Hogarth, who is the Global Head of People and Culture at Norton Rose Fulbright. So welcome, Kevin. I'm delighted you're here today. And we're going to be, and Kevin's going to be telling us more about the firm and the experience there of a global law firm. So I'm really delighted that Kevin's here today. And I'd like to thank everyone else for attending. We've got a wide range of participants today, from HRD level down to team members, colleagues, etc. So we're going to try and reflect upon as many different levels as we can and the impact on those different levels. So these sessions are really trying to focus on the business psychology. So what we're not going to be focusing on is the personal psychology. Neither Kevin nor I are experts in that area, and there are many other webinars which are covering that part, but we're going to be talking about really the business psychology stages and the changes to business. And from the start, what we've been doing is trying to anatomize the crisis, and clearly there are several stages to this crisis, which we're going to talk about in a little while. The first of these being a kind of chaotic and reactive stage, which is the stage which we experience now, probably starting about 12 weeks ago, maybe a bit longer, and going on for the first few weeks and months of the crisis. And then increasingly, we're now talking about replanning and going back to work. So there's the second stage of actually getting people back into work, getting people working positively, etc., before then moving into the third stage of the crisis, which is new reality. Because I think that we can make no mistake, this crisis is so enormous that there's no business globally who is expecting to return to exactly the conditions which they saw previously. So Kevin, I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit about Norton Rose Fulbright, the business, and explain what your role is within it. So.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Good morning, everybody. Very pleased to be here, and happy to share my experiences, which I hope will be of some use to you. Well, yeah, we're as Thomas said, we're a large global law firm. We're one of the largest law firms in the world, with over 50 offices. We operate with 5 regions, so we have a presence in Europe, into Asia, Middle East, South Africa, Australia, Canada, and the United States, and Central America. We've about 7,500 people, about 4,000 lawyers. We are working for some of the world's largest businesses, across all sectors, really. We're particularly strong in financial services, particularly strong in infrastructure, mining, commodities, and emerging presence in technology as well. So a range of clients. So some of them are huge global clients with a presence right across the whole of the world. Some of them are smaller national businesses, and we do a range of commercial law, provide a range of commercial law services to those clients.
Brilliant. And so the commercial lawyers, time in court and stuff like that, do you do that part as well?
Yeah, that's right. So it will be, it can be corporate transactions, so about buying and selling businesses, defending businesses from takeovers. It will be commercial litigation, where businesses are in dispute with one another. It can be intellectual property rights where there are issues. It can be merger and competition issues that we're having to deal with. Equally, other issues that fall out of those matters. There are a range of tax and employment issues that we'll also advise on, and we also have a real estate practice that is dealing with real estate investment, real estate portfolios, and acquisitions and disposals.
So I'm really interested in this because you've got both a broad range of different services, which I imagine were impacted in different ways, and also the global reach and the size. So I'd like to ask you, Kevin, to reflect back a little bit now and think about what it was like, what seems like a distant country now, 12 weeks ago, when the crisis began, and how did it unfold, and how did it kind of feel? What are your reflections on those stages, and how did it impact your business?
Well, it was interesting because, of course, because we have offices in Asia, then that's really where we were first affected. And I think at the time, we didn't really fully anticipate what the global impact was going to be. So we were very much sort of managing that as a local issue in those offices. The officers, sharing practices between them about how they responded, and so they were, some of the first officers to have to go into lockdown, and so that was an opportunity, actually, on reflection, for us to start to test our IT infrastructure. Again, at the time, we didn't perhaps see it that way. Again, it was just a reaction to the fact that all of a sudden, we had our lawyers in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Beijing, Shanghai, Tokyo, having to work at home. But it felt like it was something that was very much of that region. And I think perhaps, like some governments around the world, we were perhaps a little bit slow to really begin to anticipate that this thing was going to sweep across the whole of the world, and that we needed to get ready for that. Then, as it started to emerge in Europe, in Italy, in Spain, for example, I think we began to realise that this was something which was much more substantial, and that we needed to get ready for what we had seen in Asia, starting to apply those practices in the rest of the world. And so we did, I think. Then, Tom, have the benefit of the fact that we had colleagues in those offices who were able to share their experiences with us. And I'll give you one very clear example of that. We had tried before we went into lockdown in those locations different ways of reducing how many people we had in the office. And so we tried alternate day working, where certain people would come in on Monday, and then others would come in on Tuesday, others in on a Wednesday, and we quickly found that was very disruptive for people, and we found that alternate week working was far more effective, and we'll come to it later when we start talking about as we move into the unlock phase. How we've been starting to open up some of our offices, but as it spread into Europe, it felt pretty chaotic, I have to say. People were working very long hours, no precedents really. There was nothing to rely upon. A great leveler in some respects, in that I had no more experience of dealing with a global pandemic than anybody else in the team. And so, whereas those of us who are in leadership roles might, in some occasions, be expected to be able to bring our previous experience to bear, this wasn't one of those occasions. So, a great leveler where we would genuinely be problem solving as a team, everybody together, trying to determine what the right solutions for the business actually were. A lot of collaboration, and so we organise ourselves into 5 regions, and at a client level they're very integrated, but then for the business operations they do run quite separately. But on this occasion there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of sharing of information from one part of the world to another, to try and avoid reinventing the wheel, but also simply because of the speed at which we were having to move in order to respond to the crisis. The other thing I would say that characterised it was a lot of uncertainty. You know, how long is this going to go on for? Is this something that we're going to be locked down for, you know, a few weeks, or is this going to be a few months? You know, what's the nature of that lockdown going to be? Because it has varied around the world, how governments have responded.
Yes.
And also uncertainty about how governments were reacting and the sort of support and regulations that they were putting in place, and how we should respond to those. So, you know, those who are here in the UK will be familiar with the furlough program. You know, similar programs have been adopted in other parts of the world, but at times it was very difficult to understand, you know, what would that scheme, what would those schemes, those programs entail. You know, there wasn't a great deal of information available at the outset. So trying to navigate through that uncertainty was also something that very much characterised that early stage.
We've heard over this series of broadcasts from businesses where effectively, in many cases, where their business was closed down, so that they were unable to get to the tools of the trade, unable to actually continue in any functioning way at all. I mean, how much of that was true in a legal context? Because it sounds somewhat that the location change was important, but did the work disappear in the way it has in other sectors?
So the nature of the work has changed somewhat, but certainly we've been perfectly able to continue to serve our clients working remotely as effectively as we can do in most respects, as we can do when we're working from the office. Mm-hmm. But as you probably understand, the nature of the services and the support that our clients needed has changed. You know, those who were considering mergers and acquisitions, you know, we're putting those on hold, so that a lot of that type of business was starting quite quickly to dry up. But then other types of business very quickly emerged. Sadly, you know, a great deal on the restructuring and insolvency side. All of a sudden, a huge spike in businesses needing advice about how they dealt with the financial consequences of the crisis. Businesses that very quickly needed to raise additional capital, that needed to refinance their businesses, and therefore, you know, that we needed to support them in that respect. And also business and commercial disputes. Again, you can imagine, you know, where businesses were not able to fulfill their contracts and their obligations to their own customers and to clients. Disputes are about you know, what was owed to each other, what they were obliged to do, and what they were not obliged to do. So, although the nature of the work has shifted a bit, the volume of work actually hasn't diminished, and we have been every bit as busy. When we look at it in the round, we've been every bit as busy, in fact, in some respects, busier than we were prior to the crisis. This is very interesting. I mean, so presumably another dimension that, because we hear from, we're seeing generally that in some businesses, some people are busier than they were ever before, and other people are less busy or indeed not busy at all. And this is a characteristic across all sectors. And one of the things we're seeing as well is that people at home, you can't supervise their work and support them in their work in the same way as you could in the office. Because frankly, you know, I don't know how often it happens in law firms, but you know, a senior partner goes around and sends people home.
because they are working too hard. But presumably those kind of controls, that kind of mechanism to support the team is a lot harder to achieve when they're working from home.
Yes, and so we've had to think quite carefully about our duty of care to our people. And certainly we've been very concerned about mental health issues. And of course, the pressures that apply come from many sources. Yes, there are clearly work pressures for some. It's perhaps harder to switch off at the end of the day if the laptop is still sat there on the kitchen table or wherever it's set up. There's no, your colleagues aren't leaving the office and giving you that sort of that visual clue that it's time to start to pack up and go home. But equally, people have been working in environments where perhaps their technology isn't quite as good as they would like it to be. Their broadband, has meant that it's harder to participate in the Zoom calls that have become a feature of all of our lives. Or they've got school-age children that need to be looked after during the day. A whole host of additional pressures that have come to come into play for people. We are from a workload perspective, though, we do have very, very good data on who is busy, what hours they are working, and so we've been able to monitor that. We have in many parts of the world a resource management function, and their role is to try and make sure that we are distributing work as fairly, as equitably, as efficiently as possible, and so they're constantly looking at that data. Who's busy, when new work comes in, who does it get allocated to try and avoid perhaps some of those practices that have been prevalent in law firms in the past, which is that our partners have their favourite associates and they always give their work to those same associates. Our resource managers are intervening and saying, they don't have capacity to take this on, but we have these other associates who have the right skills in order to do this work. We need to allocate it to them.
Yes, but that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because you're one's favourite associates, etc., formulating new relationships with new associates when you get busy must be a lot harder in the virtual world than it was previously.
Well, yes, I think relationship building is one of the things that is certainly harder to do when you're not spending time face to face. But equally, I think there are some benefits that have come from this. Obviously, partners are working with some different associates, but also Zoom is when we're working on global matters. Quite often you'll have a concentration of people in one location. So maybe you'll have a concentration of people in London or New York, and then you'll have other people dotted around the world to support this particular matter. And of course, when you're having team conference calls, if you're the one person that is sat in Los Angeles and there are 5 people in London and there are 5 people in New York, it's sometimes quite hard to make a useful contribution as the sole person sat on the phone in Los Angeles. We've actually seen the technology that we're using to be a great leveler because everybody's in the same position. We're all on Skype or we're all on Zoom. And so I do think that for many of our associates, there's been an opportunity to make more of a contribution, particularly in the smaller offices, when they're working on matters where there's a concentration of people in some of the larger offices, to the extent that we've even talked about continuing to use some of the technology like Zoom to a much greater extent when we're all back into a more normal way of working, with a greater proportion of us back in the office, because we recognise that there's an impact of having a concentration of people in a single location.
Mm-hmm. And Zoom is Actually, this occurred to me. This is a bit off the main topic, but is Zoom secure enough? Do we know this for some of the conversations which obviously need to happen? I'm presuming there are conversations which traditionally would occur in a kind of closed-off room somewhere
Yeah,
within a corporate area or within your offices, etc., which previously you wouldn't have trusted to technology.
yeah,
Has that
yeah, yeah.
has that come up? Have people?
Oh, absolutely, and there has been some publicity about Zoom, but we have our information security people have satisfied themselves, and we've implemented certain protocols that mean that we're entirely confident that that Zoom is secure. Not all of our clients, however, feel that way, and so we have to respect those views. Others require us to, our preferred mode is Zoom, but we have other clients who prefer to use Teams or whatever, and of course, so we have to be able to swap to using whatever their preferred medium is.
Well, that's really interesting. I will take heart from that because it has occurred to me a little bit about using these tools, etc. But if you guys in Norton Rose Fulbright have assessed it and believe that it's secure enough for you guys, then it's going to be secure enough for us. I think that's
We're
really
happy with it. We're happy with it.
yeah, that's very good. So the what I think is really interesting is that in that early stage, it was very hard to think about the future and what was going to happen next, etc. Things were changing on a daily basis. It was slightly chaotic, we found, and very reactive. So we were dealing with issues which were coming up today, and it was very hard actually to kind of track timelines, etc. So it was a very complicated, reactive stage. And thankfully, I think we're now through that. And what we're seeing from businesses is that there are, in the replanning and the restart, there are kind of two levels to this. The first level is the getting people back to the office and reopening our facilities, etc. And I'd like to ask you to reflect on that in a moment, Kevin, and tell us what's happened there, because I imagine your story being global business is very interesting. And then there's the longer term, and then what is the new reality and what are the plans towards that? So starting with the first part, which is the restart, what's the experience been like? Because presumably some regions, uniquely in your case, are actually starting to emerge from the crisis. So
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. And I think we're in quite a fortunate position, Tom, because we're not a business that we are. The economic viability of our business is not going to be determined by how quickly we can get back into our offices. We have demonstrated that actually we have an operating model which is working perfectly well. We're able to serve our clients. Our business, as I said, has not dropped off a cliff. We're busy generating revenues. Yes, of course, our clients are asking, who are financially stressed, are asking for us to, they can delay payments, can they, secure additional discounts, and so there is financial pressure on the business, but it's not existential. We're not going to go out of business at the end of the month if we don't get our people back in the office. So to some extent, we have that luxury of time that isn't afforded to all businesses. But there are, I think, some emerging pressures to have people back in the offices, not least from our own people. When we surveyed them a little while ago, I think people were pretty content with continuing to work at home. I think actually in the past few weeks that has started to change, and indeed, as you say, in some parts of the world, who are now unlocked and emerging from the crisis. So those Asia offices who were first into the crisis, people are back working in those offices, and we started with adopting the A and B alternate week model, and we've been able to relax that a bit now. And so, for example, our Hong Kong office is back to working pretty much as it was pre-crisis. Our Australian offices are, as of last week, starting to open up, again with the A and B alternate week working. And so, and we expect that also to be the case across Europe and North America, where we'll start to see some offices opening up. Now, one of the factors that is, I think, probably going to be particularly influential on how quickly offices open up again is the way in which people travel to work. We recently conducted a survey in the United States, we literally got the results yesterday, and it's very interesting seeing the different attitudes of our people from cities like New York and Washington and Los Angeles, where they're traveling into the office predominantly using public transport, to offices like Houston and Dallas and San Antonio, St. Louis, Denver, where they're primarily traveling into the office by car. And there are still high levels of anxiety about traveling into the office if people are traveling by public transport. And so I think we will see this unlock happening at different speeds, depending on issues such as access to the mode of transport and the ability of people to be able to drive to work as opposed to going by train or subway or tube.
Yes, and presumably we're talking about some territories. I mean, Australia's of great interest here, I think, because basically they are talking about the COVID virus being extinct within those territories. Yes. And here in the UK and Europe, I think that they're expecting a different model to occur where it continues to be a danger, less and a kind of background danger, ideally, but where we're not seeking to or expecting to see it being entirely extinct. So presumably, whereas some offices, some of your territories are going to have to continue to operate in very different ways. We may not in the UK be going back in the same way as. I
think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right. We are going to. Over the coming months, we're going to have an experience where we have offices that have returned to working in a very similar way to the way that they were working. I'll come back and say a word about that, but I don't think it will be quite the same as it was before. I think that there will be a lasting legacy of this crisis. But then we'll have a number of offices, and I think it will be those big offices like London, New York, Washington, where, as I say, people are reliant on public transport, where we will be able to allow a greater number of people into the office, but we will probably still allow people to act on their own wishes. And so those who wish to go back into the office, we may well be able to, we're planning to be able to allow those people to go back into the office with a modified office. And so we have invested in Perspex screens. We have invested in temperature test technology as people go into the office. We've invested in the development of an app where we can track how many people are actually in the office at any one time, so that we can control that. We will obviously be socially distancing in the office. We won't have any food service. We'll have the elevators used for journeys up in the building only. You won't be one person in the elevator. We'll have stairwells that are designated as up stairwells and others that are designated as down stairwells. And we'll have predetermined routes that you're able to walk through the office to avoid two-way traffic. So all of those arrangements are being put in place to create a safe environment where people can return to the office. But we've already made statements that we are not going to require our people to return to the office before they feel safe to do so. But as I mentioned, I think that there are a number of people who have actually experienced working at home for a sustained period of time for the first time in their careers, and I think that we have a significant proportion of our workforce who want to have a different working week to the one that they experienced pre-crisis.
Yeah.
They do want, I think, to return to the office. They want to have more social interaction with their colleagues. They're looking forward to having a greater variety in their day than just sitting at in their home office at their dining room table or kitchen table or wherever they're working from. But equally, they have enjoyed some of the freedoms and some of the differences in their lifestyle that working at home has allowed them. So we're anticipating that we're very unlikely to ever return to the levels of occupancy in our offices that we experienced pre-crisis, because we'll have a much greater proportion of our workforce that are working 2-3 days a week from home. So that will be different. And so we are, I think, as you were alluding to earlier on, Tom, we are now starting to think about, well, what is that future going to be like?
So I'm going to pick up on that a little bit more now, actually, because you mentioned the A and B model. I think this is of great interest to me and to everyone listening. So what is the A and B model? How was it created? Why is it not an ABC model? And is it a weekly thing? Is it a daily thing? What was your experience of actually a reopening and the specifics of it? I think are really interesting to many of us. I'm here in my office on my own, so I don't have A's and B's. So what is all of this, Kevin, and how does it work?
Well, this is to reduce the capacity in our offices by 50%, so that we can maintain social distancing in the office. And so, for example, in open plan areas, people would be sat at every alternate desk rather than sitting next to each other. In our lawyer offices, where typically in London we would have 4 lawyers in what we call a little studio office. There'll only be 2 lawyers in that office. But the A and B model, we have tried to do that on the basis of teams going into the office, rather than splitting a team in half and saying half of that team goes in one week, half the team goes in the following week. And we've one of the reasons why we've done it on a week by week basis is because we do a deep clean at the weekend, and so we have upped the cleaning regime to try and give assurance to the group B when they come in on the Monday, that the office is as clean as it was when group A came in the Monday in the previous week. We do think that there's benefit in bringing teams in together for the reasons I was talking about, in terms of the social cohesion, the interaction between people. That's what they're missing. So people don't really want to come into the office to be surrounded by a bunch of strangers. They want to come into the office where they can at least have some social interaction with their colleagues, with the people that they are accustomed to working with. And we found that a week is a reasonable planning period for people. So the alternate day model, people having to take their laptop, carry it in, carry it out, carry it in, carry it out, all of that sort of stuff. It was easier to set things up on a week by week basis. So that's the model that we've adopted. We adopted as we went back to work in Asia. That's back to the office. Everybody's still working back to the office in Asia. And that's the model that we're adopting in Australia. I think it will depend on, as you say, the situation in each of those countries and how prevalent the virus continues to be. In Australia, I think we'll move back to a situation really quite quickly where everybody who is able will go back into the office.
Very interesting. Very interesting. We'll reflect in a little bit on that future and how much we think people actually will take advantage of that. But I've got another question which I was thinking about while you were talking. This question about how safe is safe. So we've got a kind of legislative view, and there's a lot of debate in the news at the moment about whether it's 2 meters or 1 meter, which is the right distance and all that stuff. But as employers, we all have a responsibility to provide a safe environment. So, how do we judge whether is it best endeavours, or is it an absolute safeness one has to create? And kind of what should we be targeting in this area? Because there are compromises to going back to work, I imagine, particularly in an environment where the disease still exists, and those compromises are inevitable. But you've mentioned 50%, but you might have chosen 20%, presumably, and this is a yes. So I don't know if you've got any reflections on that, Kevin.
Well, I think we, in terms of our duty of care, because we have said to our people that we won't ask anybody to go back until they feel that they are ready to go back into the office. Yes. That our responsibility, therefore, is to explain to our people the measures that we have taken. What is it that we have done to try and ensure that it is a safe working environment? And also to very much stress the point that it is not in our interests to have our people coming back into a working environment where we see an outbreak. To have to close that office down again. It is our worst nightmare, the idea that we open up one of our offices and that within 2 weeks we've found that actually a number of people are taken ill with COVID-19, and the entire office is then having to quarantine and self-isolate again. We have to close the office down again. So we are being very, very careful. We are, as I say, explaining them the measures that we're taking to our people, and then we are saying to them, it's your choice. If you are still reluctant to return to work, then it is your choice to continue to work at home. Now, we may get to a point in several months' time when we genuinely believe that the risk is now so small that where an individual is still expressing some reservations about coming back to work, that we'll have to have a conversation with them about the reasonableness of their objections. But at the moment, we don't envisage that's going to happen anytime soon.
That's really, really useful, actually, understanding us, that articulating what are the measures, explaining the measures which are in place, warning people of the risks which exist, and then allowing them to formulate a judgment. Seems like a very appropriate approach. I mean, I think one of the things which is interesting is that there is this change in responsibility, I think, globally between employer and employee. So, for example, you're relying on people who are exposed to others with the illness, not attending the office, etc. And obviously, one cannot tell for them whether they have or not. So that level of responsibility which we're applying to team members, colleagues, etc., is kind of very different to what it was before, where those kind of rules would be kind of applied by the business rather than by the individual. And I think this is a longer term change. This responsible.
Well, I think so. Although I think we were moving in this direction already, Tom. I would say in many of our offices around the world, we have been trying to create a culture which is one where if people feel that they are best placed they are well placed to be able to undertake what they need to do in that day, working at home, then they have the choice to do that, and that is something which we expect them to talk to their team leader about and say, look, I've got all this to do. I'm planning to work at home on Thursday, but to create much more of a sense of individuals choosing for themselves how they will be most productive, how they get their work done, and where they undertake that work. Now, attitudes to that sort of flexible, agile working, call it what you will, have varied around the world, I would say. Certainly in Australia, I would say there's been that's been adopted quite extensively. In the United States, much less, actually, much more of a resistance in the United States to allowing people that freedom. So already on that journey, what this crisis has done, I think, is to accelerate that. And because our productivity hasn't dropped. In fact, in many areas, as I've said, our productivity is actually higher. Our associates are recording more hours, more time than they were pre-crisis. I'm optimistic that some of those partners who were perhaps skeptical about what the impact would be of allowing people to work at home at scale. We've gone from relatively small proportions of people to all of our people working at home, and the pendulum will probably settle somewhere in the middle on average. But I think some of the skepticism that was there. Our partners now, we have data to demonstrate to them that their worst fears will not be realised if a greater proportion of our lawyers are busy working at home during the week.
It is really interesting, isn't it? Because reflecting on that, our attitude to different kind of absences has always been inconsistent. So I'm just thinking that, for example, when people used to, when we all went to work, turn up late for work and then say, oh, the tube was down or there was a traffic thing, when colleagues and team leaders would be very understanding of that. It would be, oh, one of those things kind of thing. But, that's an hour or whatever out of a day. Whilst if in the other side of that, if somebody is working at home and are phoned up and they say, I'm taking a long lunch break, or I've got to go and deal with the kids or something like that, then typically we were much less understanding of that kind of a temporary absence from work. And I wonder if that's kind of, because that's a big journey for a lot of our colleagues and team leaders, where they're used to judging different types of absences in different ways, often unconsciously. And I wonder whether that attitude is going to change positively because of the crisis.
Well, with some individuals it will, and with some individuals it won't. But I think one of the things that I'm struck by is that I do think that some of those who are fortunate enough not to have some of the pressures that other colleagues have come to appreciate just how challenging it can be. Yes. And so, when people are trying to join a Zoom, and their kids are running around in the background, and they're having to deal, and this is particularly probably true of some of our men, some of my male colleagues, that they realise quite how difficult it is to combine working and childcare, so I do think that there's been an insight into what some of the challenges are that people face, and I think therefore also much more of a willingness to accept the flexibility. So the fact that homeschooling, it's very hard to say to a colleague, no, I think you should leave your children unsupervised. I don't think you should be doing any homeschooling, and that you must, as a priority, attend to the work that I'm giving you. And, that's a pretty hard message to say to somebody. And of course, what our associates have been doing is saying, look, I need to. It's my turn to look after the kids for the next couple of hours, but I'll get this done. I'll be able to do this evening. I'll get it done then, and I'll get it back to you later on this evening. So I think that, again, the whole ethos of trying to create much more flexibility in how people work that we were trying to do pre the crisis. The crisis has demonstrated that is entirely possible to work in that way, and I'm hoping that it will clear away some of the prejudice and some of the skepticism that was there previously.
It's very interesting because this is obviously talking to you, Kevin. What I'm hearing and what I'm reflecting on is that actually you at Norton Rose are seeing some really quite positive opportunities which have come out of this. So the things we're talking about these changes, I'm assuming were on your agenda previously and have been kind of accelerated by the thing, and this greater understanding and greater inclusivity which you're describing really is actually been accelerated by this crisis.
Well, I think that's right, Tom. I mean, I wouldn't have wanted it to have happened this way, but certainly the crisis has demonstrated that it's possible to work in a different way. It's demonstrated to us actually that we can make decisions much more quickly. As you know, going back to our earlier discussion about that crisis phase, we couldn't take a year and a half to go through a pilot and then an extended rollout of Zoom. We weren't using Zoom before the crisis, and within a matter of weeks we were, and we had satisfied ourselves about the security aspects, and we had contracted on a global basis for the use of Zoom, and we did all of that in a matter of weeks because we had to. And I have to say that as we return to post-COVID, to a period post-COVID, I think we will continue to challenge ourselves. Well, if we could do that during the crisis, why can't we do that now? Why can't we make decisions as quickly as that? Why can't we roll these projects out as quickly as we did? So I think certainly we've seen those benefits. I think we've seen benefits of collaboration and innovation, because, as I said, there was no playbook for this. We couldn't turn to something and say, right, okay, crisis management manual, page 24 says how you deal with everybody at the same time having to go and work at home. We didn't envisage for several months. We didn't envisage that was going to be one of the scenarios that we would be dealing with. And I think we've learned about how we very quickly deal with problems, problem solve, innovate, and quickly implement solutions, because that has been what we've had to do.
Yes,
Tom, can I feed in some questions? We've got lots of questions coming in. I'm aware of the time.
Yes. I was just going to come back to that. So what questions have we got, Becky?
So we've got a question from Lisette, and I hope I've said that right. Lisette said, at this time where employees are facing technology fatigue, headhunters are calling, and the client work may be softening, what are some quick fire suggestions to refocus employee engagement efforts at grassroots?
So I do think that issues of employment engagement are absolutely critical, because I think people are starting to get fatigued by this experience. That's what I was saying around this emerging desire to get back into the office. And I think that some of the things that we were doing in the early days of virtual cocktail hours and quizzes and things like that, in just the same way as when we run those in the office, after a while people get tired of the same things, and you have to find some different things. So but more importantly than that, actually, I think that we mustn't lose sight of those things that people value when they're in the office, and what is it that really drives engagement. And so certainly in my environment, people are interested in what's the quality of the work that they're getting. Is it challenging and demanding work? What development are we offering them? How is their career going to advance? And these are issues, very much an issue for our people when we're working in this way, as it is in the office. And we can't just say, well, we're going to pause all of those discussions. We're not going to do anything about that. We still need to be attending to those issues, because that's what drives engagement. And I think our people will remember, if we have continued to invest in them as individuals, and have continued to engage with them as individuals, they will remember that when we come out of the crisis, and we will be able to sustain the levels of engagement that we want. So we have to encourage team leaders, managers, partners to be having those one-to-one conversations that they probably would be having perhaps on a more informal basis. If they were sort of in the office together, then they'd be having a cup of coffee together, they'd have lunch together. There has to be a little bit more planning, more scheduling involved, and we certainly, in my function as HR professionals, have to be making sure that we're prompting our team leaders and our managers to do those things that are important in driving engagement.
Great answer, thanks, Kevin. I've got another one from Jonathan. So Jonathan works in a different law firm, and he says, one thing I've observed is the adverse effect on mental health of a poorly done appraisal. So colleagues spend a year not knowing where they stand with their manager, nothing's marked down about their performance during the year at all. Then at the end of the year, said employee is hit by a bombshell of underperformance. How can we mitigate against this, given many employers will be undertaking performance reviews in the midst of a pandemic?
Yeah, and we've been doing our performance reviews during this period. But I think the impact of a performance review done badly is pretty significant, whether it's done face to face in an office environment or whether it's done remotely. Although I think there are some potentially worse consequences if it's done remotely, because there isn't still that same opportunity to perhaps to engage with the support network that you would have. So what would you do if you had a bad appraisal? Well, you're probably going to have a chat with your best friend. You come out of that appraisal and you'd be thinking, cracky, that was pretty rough. It wasn't what I was expecting. I feel pretty rotten about that. You'd probably go and say to your best friend in the office, look, do you mind coming for a cup of coffee? I just want to have a chat about this. That's harder to do. So again, we need to be, and this is something that we've tried hard to do. Only time will tell whether we have been successful. We've been investing in the development of our team leaders about how to conduct meetings, appraisals, one-to-one development conversations remotely. What's different about that? And a lot of it is about the planning and the structure and the follow-up that you need to have. And so we've tried to think about how do we mitigate the consequences of operating in this way. And then at the worst, in terms of dealing with the worst consequences of this, where a poorly delivered appraisal or anything else that is a consequence of this current crisis is having a significant impact on the mental health of our people, then we've reinvigorated our mental health first aiders network, so that and been encouraging them to reach out to colleagues to check in with them. We've been making sure that we provide access and promote access to all of the resources that we have. We have a ton of resources online that are available to give people further advice, to point them to other resources, to point them to support resources. Yeah. And so, we've been continuing to do that.
Brilliant. So Becky, time for one more question, and then I think we need to bring this to...
Oh, good, because I wanted to ask this one. So this is from our friend Nigel. Nigel says, Kevin, how will you ensure managers do not favour the people who are visible by being back in the office compared to those who continue to work from home?
Good one.
That's a very good question. That's a great question. I hadn't thought of that, so I've just made a note of that. So thank you, Nigel, for that. I'm going to go away and give some further thought to that, because that is it's an extreme version of presenteeism, isn't it? And so we've always had problems with how we deal with presenteeism, the need to feel as though you need to be in the office in order to catch the partner's eye, get the best work, etc., etc. And we need to try and make sure that our people don't feel that pressure to get back into the office in order to avoid missing out on the good work. We are fortunate, as I mentioned earlier, in having our resource management function. They are something of an interface between the partners and the associates. So if associates feel as though they are missing out on the quality of work or the nature of work that they want, rather than having to go and face a partner to have that conversation, they actually can now have that discussion with the resource manager, who is an interface, and without necessarily going straight off to the partner to say, oh, Kevin's concerned that he's not getting this type of work. They can bring that into conversations over the coming weeks as to what work Kevin gets allocated. So it's a very good question. We will need to spend some time thinking about how we monitor that. And again, we'll be looking to our resource managers to give us data. We'll be able to get data on that, because we will know who is in the office. We need to track that in a way to an even greater extent than we ever have done in the past, because we need to manage the numbers that we have in the office. So we'll have very, very accurate data about who has been in the office and when and for what amount of time. And we will be able to use that with the resource management work allocation data to say, are there any patterns here? Are we seeing those associates who are in the office more frequently than some of their colleagues being allocated work? And that's very similar to the sort of analysis that we've done in the past with regards to part-time associates. You know, are part-time associates at a disadvantage to their full-time colleagues in terms of the amount and the quality of the work that we're allocating to them?
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because the whole relationship between colleagues is going to change. You know, I can envisage the kind of senior partner walking into a room, or one of the more senior partners, and saying hi to everybody. I hope you're all well. That touch point is missing now, and replacing it in different ways is going to be these non-formal touch points which occur in our previous working lives are going to have to be thought through again and recreated. And I think it's there are many dimensions to this, which I think we're going to be focusing on in future webinars. So I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of today to join us. It's great to see for so many of you to attend, and I'd like to thank Kevin for taking us through the experience at Norton Rose Fulbright, which has been incredibly interesting and incisive. So Kevin, thank you very much.
Thank you. Delighted to have been able to contribute, and I hope that there's been something of interest and that's been useful for your participants, Tom.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Absolutely, and I would, and then we're going to continue with this series of webinars as the crisis continues and unfolds. And so, weekly basis, we're going to be doing webinars with other leaders of other businesses, as we have been doing for the last 11 weeks now. And we are also doing webinars increasingly on automation and AI and supporting businesses post COVID in that way. So I'd like to bring today's to a close and thank everybody for attending. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.